We're waiting for Harsh to come online. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Uh, this episode of On the Front Lines is with Harsh Mander, and we are going to be talking about solidarity and kindness in the time of the corona pandemic. We also have with us Prachi, who's going to be translating this into sign language. For all our viewers, uh, please do put in your questions and comments on the live platforms that we're streaming in YouTube, in Facebook, on Twitter, and Twitch. Welcome, Harsh. Thank you so much for joining us. Harsh, are you here with us?
Yeah. Thank you, Rishabh. Thank
Hi.
you. Pleasure to be with all of you today. Do you want me to start?
Yes, we'll start. So, Harsh, a little while ago, you had written an article in the Indian Express talking about solidarity and how it will be the most decisive weapon in fighting this warlike situation. Could you tell us what you meant by solidarity and why you feel it is the most decisive weapon?
Solidarity, to my mind, is, uh, is the idea that to all the differences that we have of class, of gender, of religious identity, of ethnicity, of, of caste, of national boundary, we stand together uh, as one people. Solidarity has many sibling ideas, what I like to call sibling ideas. These are ideas like fraternity, which is written into the constitution. Fraternity literally means brotherhood. There's a problem because it leaves out sisterhood. But the Hindi word for fraternity in our constitution is bandhuta, which is a lovely word. हम एक दूसरे से बंधे हुए. We are bound to and with each other. Noam Chomsky talks about solidarity in the context uh, of caring. It's the idea that we must care for each other. Uh, we may, we can talk about empathy uh, as another sibling idea of solidarity. Empathy is feeling the pain of another as though it is one's own. Uh, we can talk about compassion. Compassion, there's a problem often with how compassion is understood because there seem to be somebody is giving compassion and somebody is a recipient of it. But I like to think about what I call egalitarian compassion, which is a compassion between two equal human beings. One who is going through a particularly difficult moment and the other is reaching out, but is available also for the other person to reach out when I am in need. So this is the broadest idea of solidarity. And as I wrote in my article in the Union Express, a metaphor that is used a lot these days is, in the context of fighting the pandemic, is the metaphor of war, of a world war actually. And this war has many obvious weapons. If you stay with that metaphor, but the weapons are science, our health services. A great deal depends on the quality of our political and social leadership, on the kinds of public investments and decisions we make. But I believe that overarching and even beyond all of this, uh, what will determine uh, how how we will emerge at the other side of this uh, virtually unprecedented crisis uh, will depend a great deal on our capacity for solidarity. Uh, the pandemic, uh, you know, has hit the world, and each of us are, I think, beginning to realize the almost unprecedented nature of the crisis that confronts us. I could not recall a moment like this in my lifetime, and I just uh, turned 65 2 days ago. Uh, it's a crisis uh, that I think we must understand is that the crisis, to my mind, has not been created by the virus. The crisis has been created by this mutating virus, highly contagious virus. Uh, when it hits a society of such enormous inequality, uh, that is what has created the crisis. Uh, that in India, uh, we are a society and a country with immense social, economic, political inequality. Uh, and what is more worrying to me, and I have often spoken and written about this, is not the material facts of these inequalities, but our cultural comfort with these inequalities. The fact that people of privilege are so comfortable culturally with these inequalities, which basically that our life destinies are so entirely different, based almost entirely on the accident of where we are born and to whom we are born. And so, what is really different between me, my child, and a child who's forced to sleep alone on the streets, who I see every day while driving to work and coming back, and yet I turn my face away. Uh, there's nothing really different uh, between these two children at a fundamental level, except the accident of their birth. And yet, my child will have every comfort that I can provide to her. And this other little girl, just maybe a kilometer away from my home, will be sleeping on the streets uh, under the open sky on cold winter nights. Will find her food maybe in a waste heap, and might get raped through the night. Will never see the inside of a school. The fact that that it doesn't trouble me, in the middle class, to see these inequalities which should be completely intolerable to us. That I think is the reason for the crisis that we are staring in the face, and its many manifestations are only slowly becoming clear to us. Uh, uh, that we have a society where solidarity is completely broken by the inequalities with which we are so comfortable, and therefore when the crisis of the pandemic has hit us, uh, how we are responding to it, and what will be the consequences in both of uh, the pandemic, as if it spreads, if infection spreads, but more so how the public policy responses that we have crafted to it. Who is it protecting, and from whom is it extracting which costs, is are questions that I don't think we are asking, and we're not in the middle class. We're not troubled by. Very briefly, let me explain. Uh, See, when the Prime Minister announces with 4 hours notice that we're going into a 21-day lockdown, uh, he he tell he tells the people listening to his speech that you need to go stay at home, work from home, uh, keep social distance, wash your hands regularly, and so on. There are many assumptions here. There's assumption is that you have a home. The assumption is that it is possible for you to survive by staying at home because you have an assured income, which will get you through this entire period of crisis. Uh, and and that you have a home where there's enough space for social distance to happen, that you have a running water supply where you can wash your hands regularly. the reality is that that might be true for say 300 million people, 400 million people in this country to some varying degrees. But it is not the fact that we have actually, used a method for fighting this pandemic, which actually, on the one hand, does not offer them the same protections because they do not have the capacity to stay confined in a in a 6 by 6 or 10 by 10 house with 10 people inside it, with a common toilet which 150 people use, with work which is completely not has no social security, with no labor rights, with no running water. You spend maybe a fifth of your daily earnings to buy a pot of water. In those circumstances, on the one hand, these protections are not even realistic for the large mass of our poor. And on the other hand, the costs that are being borne is massively, disproportionately uh, borne by the poor. We are sitting in our homes and suffering from boredom and depression and so on. What a poor person and the 9 out of 10 million uh, workers are in the informal sector. They are they're living they're forced suddenly to live in circumstances where they don't have their next day's earning. They have no savings to fall back upon. And I think that it is that that we have tolerated this approach, and we have supported it visibly, in many ways, that reflects a profound failure of solidarity and compassion, and empathy, above all. So when a 12-year-old child uh, is walking 100 kilometers in the hot sun without food and water, to reach her home, uh, and she dies on the way, uh, how many of us would have accepted a situation where our own child, or younger sister, is placed in a similar situation? Uh, if any of us were trapped at the time of the lockdown, when the lockdown was trapped, you're trapped in a place far away from the place that you call home, and uh, and you are, uh, you have no money and you have no resources, uh, and most of all, you're frightened about an illness which you don't know when it can catch up with you, and you will be desperate naturally to be home. And we understood it with regard to the students who were caught abroad, and special planes at public expense were organized to fly them in. Uh, we understood it even just now with the students caught up in Kota, for whom hundreds of special buses were organized. But we don't seem to understand it for literally lakhs and lakhs of migrant workers who were trapped in a similar situation around the country. And most of us in the middle class were completely stunned, I think, by the images of thousands and thousands of people walking down the streets, hundreds of kilometers to reach home. But why were we stunned? Firstly, because these are the people who actually make our life possible. These are the people we meet and see and interact every day with. These are the people who build our homes, who clean our homes, who take care of our children, who uh, drive our vehicles, who sell us stuff, who work in the malls, who are part of our everyday life. But we never have looked upon them as people who have and should have rights. And when a crisis like this has hit us, effectively, we, the middle class, with our governments, have thrown poor people under the bus. We have just ejected them from our lives to their own devices. And I think that that failure of solidarity is profound to me. Uh, Even if if we in the middle class are assured our income, the poor must be also assured their income. I mean, the government should have, to me, most obviously, should have said that for every day of the lockdown, every person will be assured at least the statutory minimum wage. Uh, and if we say we can't afford it, which is not true, India has the largest lockdown, one of the most severe lockdowns uh, in a country with the largest number of poor people, with the smallest percentage of GDP being devoted to the protections that we are offering. So, if less than 1% of GDP is actually being committed, 5% of GDP would have enabled us to actually provide this this basic common terms to the poor working person. What the government is now saying is we appeal to employers to, to pay their salaries. Firstly, it's not an act of charity. It has to be an act of right. It has to be a right with dignity and with certainty. But studies have shown us that only 17% of the workers in the informal sector have an employer who can be identified. The others are either casual daily wage workers who earn on a daily basis, or are people who are self-account workers. So rag pickers, street vendors.
So, Harsh, before we move into the policy response to this, I have a few questions for you.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
you spoke about our cultural comfort with the idea that inequality has always existed. And within that frame, you know, you've also said that the middle class was stung by visuals of migrants on the roads walking back home. Um, in your experience, have you seen, what do you feel about uh, middle class solidarity that has been on offer, um, and do you see that as a just response? Is it mere compassion, or is that a justiciable response that you've seen?
No, I do. I mean, see, everything is not completely dark. Uh, I with my colleagues, we are on the streets. We set out from the second day. We worked with homeless people, so we were initially deeply worried about what would happen to homeless people who depend, who have very casual, uncertain work in the best of times, and who depend a lot on food charities. What would happen to them? So we decided that come what may, we would be out on the streets. And since then, we've tried to craft a response, and I think Natasha spoke about it a couple of days ago, the efforts of the Karwane Mohabbat. But I want to also underline that we are only one among many. I've seen many such initiatives by many groups which have come spontaneously together to try to reach food to those who are most disadvantaged. A lot of young people are volunteering their time for this, answering distress calls, raising funds, um, and some of them are willing to risk infection by being on the streets every day. Uh, while I'm on the streets, what touches me most is the sight of ordinary people, many who are not even associated with any organization, who come out onto the streets to offer food to people. When the migrants were walking, I remember standing at Gazipur talking to the migrants, and I would see cars drive up. The whole back would be full of, somebody had brought, it was full of pouches of water which they handed out to the walkers. Some brought packed food, handed it out to grateful walkers. Uh, and I found even among, especially in fact, even more so among very poor people, the amount that they've taken care of each other. Absolutely homeless people I've spoken to have talked about how they had small amount of savings, but how could I just eat? I also bought food for the next family who sleeps next to me and the next family beyond them. How could I watch their children sleep hungry? So there is these circles of kindness, as I call them, which give me hope, which tell me that there are still elements of this broken solidarity that we can still hold on to and build. But what I want to underline is that this is not a crisis that can be resolved by an appeal to individual charity. And once again, the Prime Minister in his various addresses, in the first address, he said civil society will take care of the poor. In one line, that was the one line. And in the last address, when the lockdown was extended, one of the seven things was feed some hungry people around you. That is not how uh, we as a society should be content to allow the poor have been reduced. I mean, much has been stripped away from them in this cataclysmic 1 month. But I think more than anything else, what has been stripped away from them is their dignity. But when we go out now on the street, and the desperation has grown from day to day. When we go out onto the streets now, just if a word comes that somebody is distributing food, and there's something like a stampede, people, run in large numbers, falling over each other, and no question of social distancing. We we are making people line up for food for 2 hours, 3 hours for every meal, and sometimes the lines are hundreds of meters long, sometimes kilometers long. In the hot sun, you're waiting for a small amount of food. This is not how any government should be treating uh, poor working people. They're proud people. They had fully functional lives before the lockdown happened. They were functioning not because of the support of the state, but despite the state. And I think that one of the other things that I was working with uh, Prabhat Patnaik and Joyti Ghosh on an article demanding universal PDS, but also universal cash transfers of at least 7,000 rupees to every adult worker in the country through the period of the pandemic, arguing that this was something that the country can afford and must afford. But one of the things that really hit us, and when we were writing this, is that for the rural poor, at least, because thanks to NREJ, at least we have a list of job seekers. For the urban poor, actually, there is no list that you can rely upon, because every labor law has been completely flouted. So there's an Interstate Migrant Workers Act which requires the registration of each migrant worker who comes in, but that is barely observed. We have a Building and Construction Workers Act, for instance, and studies have shown in this period that just a few percentage of people who are actually construction workers get registered, because the employers don't want to be bound down, and the state allows them this freedom. So we have allowed, and when I was saying that the pandemic hit a society which was unequal, and that is causing the crisis, we allowed a whole segment of our working people to be without any kind of labor rights, without any kind of social protection, without any kind of decent housing, without any kind of running water, and so on, and sanitation. And then the pandemic hits, and then we find a strategy which protects the middle class, but does nothing to deal with this population which we have, which has suffered many injustices and still has survived. So I think that is the point that I'm trying to make. Uh, that I think the pandemic has shown a mirror to what we are as a society. I am talking about the state, but the state is able to do this because we in the middle class, people with voice and privilege and social capital, are content with the state doing this. There's no outrage. There's no outrage that my child can get the best education that money can buy. But a child born, even my domestic help's child, can never access the same school. That I have health insurance which can give me healthcare comparable to the best available in the world. But we have allowed our public health systems to be completely broken. And what is frightening me most of all is that if there's one scenario that our hot summers and our BCG vaccinations and all the robust uh, resistance that we have developed will save the Indian population from the full hit of the pandemic. I hope desperately that is true, because if it does hit us in the way that is hitting European countries, uh, the tragedy has only just begun. Because what will happen to healthcare? What will happen to the healthcare of the poor when they have to access? They have no effective health insurance that will work for them. And what will happen to them if large numbers? See, they say that this virus loves dense population and unhygienic situation. So it might have been brought by people who can afford airplane tickets, but it will be spread most in in habitations of the poor, and they have no healthcare on which they can depend upon. And so these inequalities, these failures of our solidarity will pile up one upon the other with catastrophic outcomes.
So, uh, you the state response to this, although it's been abject to begin with, you have been petitioning various institutions through your work. Do you see any sense of solidarity emerging from the state? And by
I think
state, I mean the institutions
institutions.
alongside the police and the Supreme Court.
See, Prashant Bhushan uh, took a petition in the name of myself and Anjali Bhardwaj for the rights of migrants. And we have basically made this demand that there should be universal PDS, and they should be paid wages. Every worker should be paid wages for the period of the lockdown and the recovery. The same demand. Uh, the kind of response that we got, firstly from the central government, the way the Solicitor General spoke about it with the casualness, uh, and he claimed that food was being provided to every person across the country. The Chief Justice of India, no less than the Chief Justice of India, actually responded by saying, if they're getting food, if these workers are getting food, why should they be paid any wages? Uh, it was, I mean, it reflected uh, the most incredible lack of empathy. That, I mean, if I told any of you, anyone, if I told the respected Chief Justice himself, I'll send you a box of very good food, all 3 meals. Why should you get a salary? Would that be acceptable? If it's not acceptable to you, how can it be acceptable to the poor, who won't have savings, who don't have social protection of any kind, access to any kind of public good? So I think that, and just yesterday, the case has finally been closed after a series of hearings with no relief whatsoever. What the Chief Justice has, the bench of the Supreme Court has basically said is that we ask the government to respond appropriately to the as it to the to the petition and the demands it has made. Full stop. So we are in a terrible crisis situation, because the institutions of the state, to my mind, uh, are displaying no uh, solidarity, no empathy, and no respect for the rights and the dignity of the poor. And this is not, it's not, we're not looking for, uh, you know, for this to be based on some act of charity by the state or by society. It is a question of the most fundamental right to live with dignity and to survive with dignity. Not a single poor working person is responsible in any way for the spread of this virus. Why should they have to bear this disproportionate burden for protecting all of us from that virus? It just is so unjust, and it is not simply and injustice, it is something that will cost, you know, the young girl who died, and many, walking home, and many like her who we know and we don't know about. Uh, they must, I think, each of these should be, carved very deep into our conscience. We should carry the guilt of these deaths and this suffering, uh, and the indignity to which poor people are being served, are being put into on our hearts and on our conscience. And I hope that we can resolve, at least now that the virus has shown us so clearly, our own the image of what we have become as a society. Let us resolve that at the other side of this pandemic. In fact, while we are even working, we don't know how long we will take to reach the other side, whether it will be 6 months, whether it will be 1 year, whether it will be 2 years. Let us resolve that we at last pick up these broken pieces of our solidarity, that we build a society and a country at last which is more equal, which is more kind, and which is more just.
So, Harsh, this has also been a period of politics within the country.
Right.
Uh, a certain kind of politics has picked up, and we read about it every day. Especially, you know, trying to build a certain narrative around minorities, and of course, there are the Delhi government, for example, in several of its briefings, particularly referred to the Tablighi Jamaat incidents, and we also see a lot of trolling on social media. Do you think this is also causing divides in the society, and is an impediment to forging solidarity?
I think it is, uh, in this India is almost, a lot of the anti-poor character of the responses uh, we are seeing in many countries. I was reading an article in the New York Times, which was describing how, when you analyze for race, uh, the deaths in from COVID 19, there is a highly disproportionate burden of the deaths uh, among people of color, African Americans in the United States. And that article underlined that we have to recognize that this is not it's not an equal opportunity virus. It in the end, hits the most vulnerable, those whose lives have been most deprived and damaged. So what I talked about in India is, to a lesser or greater extent, uh, true also of other parts of the world. But I do not know any other example where there has been a systematic and such a successful campaign to actually blame a particular community uh, uh, for the spread of the virus in the way that has happened. And it is true that the organizers of the Tablighi Jamaat, which is a religious fundamentalist organization, were misguided in having a large gathering at that time. But it was by no means the only gathering at that time. Parliament was in session. The there were political meetings. MPs were being, MLAs were being bought and sold in Madhya Pradesh. There were large religious gatherings, Hindu religious gatherings, Sikh religious gatherings across. So people overall did not realize and recognize how grave the crisis was. Uh, if you pick on only one and you track only uh, one particular gathering, and those who have contact. There were 25,000 tests done in relation to the Tablighi Jamaat for several days and their contacts. Uh, any statistician will tell you the kind of statistical bias that is created from that kind of, because because uh, proportions are in relation to people tested, and I think that uh, uh, if it had just been that, and officially, even the government of India, the Joint Secretary always talks about, and he continues to do so, even though he was reprimanded. He talks about infections caused by the Jamaat. Uh, but what followed after that was uh, a massive social media campaign. Of the kind that that this is all under lockdown. Uh, but you have, we're flooded with videos which are all fake videos. Nobody has been prosecuted. Those people should be severely prosecuted for creating this kind of hatred, where fake videos and Muslims are shown as spitting on vegetables and so on, spitting into food, coughing into other people to get them. So, uh, and then you have a whole series of television channels, newspapers, uh, playing up exactly this. And literally within 4 or 5 days, the success of this political campaign to persuade large segments of ordinary Hindus, and I've talked to now many working class Hindus as well, and they also somehow have been persuaded that Muslims are somehow responsible primarily for the spread of corona in India. And the softer version of it is that there's high religious bigotry, so they continue to have these gatherings, and because of that, it is spreading. But there are large sections who are actually persuaded by this horrible venal idea that people are actually your own neighbors, sisters, brothers of our country are actually trying to kill us in some strange way through this virus. And this has led to social boycotts, to people uh, refusing to allow vendors. Vendors have started putting up flags displaying that they are Hindu, so that people buy from them. How could India have, how could we have, as a country, when we are facing our largest crisis in more than a generation, instead of standing together in solidarity, how we allowed the poison of hatred to penetrate so deep? And it cannot have happened by chance. There was clearly a political agenda and before that, a lot of difficult questions were being asked about why had we been so delayed in the response, why had we not got enough kits, why were we not doing enough testing, why we didn't have PPEs, etc., etc. Everything got diverted to this scapegoat. Before that, another scapegoat was more spontaneous, was people from the northeast, and I think that uh, uh, along with the entire anti-poor, anti-worker character of how our response as a society to this pandemic has played out, I also see uh, this unique around the world communalization uh, to this degree. And imagine if you and I were of Muslim identity, what would you be feeling today? Because being of Muslim identity, you would be sharing all the other troubles that we are sharing, the uncertainty, the loss of work, the loss. I mean, uh, the Muslims constitute the largest proportion of self-employed workers in the informal sector in urban India. None of them would have any kind of wages or salary to fall back on in this period. They would be suffering from the same fears, the same loss, the same dispossession as their Hindu brothers and sisters. But in the middle of all of this, they would also be having to deal with uh, this hatred, this completely irrational hatred of their fellow country women and men. How would one feel if one was, in addition to everything else that we were coping with, we had to cope with this completely irrational hate?
So this has clearly compounded the problems that exist today in society, and along with this, the institutional response has also been quite difficult. We have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm just going to put them to you, and I'll also encourage the audience to keep sending in their questions so that we can put them to Harsh. So Anukriti Goyal asks that after this pandemic, what change do you anticipate in attitudes of the middle income class and the state? What can be done now to create more awareness about the middle class in their roles and responsibilities?
Ankiti, I really hope, I think that uh, I do think that the long march of the migrants has touched people a great deal. Uh, I think the last sort of images of the poor and their suffering and loss, which has touched people in the same way, has been the series of farmer suicide. I think these are images that will stay with us for a generation, maybe. Uh, how, but even the farmer suicide uh, have not spurred us to change the reality of public policy. I mean, the situation of farmers is because of primarily because of our public policies and very very low public investments in the agricultural sector, and even less for the rural poor. So, so it's not as if these public policy changes are going to happen automatically. I do think that uh, this is a time when I chose to speak on this subject in the context of the pandemic is really for us to start this conversation in many places. Now that this mirror is before us about the kind of society we've allowed ourselves to be, is this how we want to remain? Can we at least in the future say there has to be a floor of human dignity below which we will not allow anybody to fall? No child should have to sleep hungry. No child should have to sleep under an open sky. No one should die because they just can't afford healthcare. Uh, no old person should have to struggle to their last day without support, or a person with disabilities uh, without state support and pension. I think that we can draw up a list of this kind, and several of us have sat down and actually drawn up this idea of what we call universal social rights. And I think that our struggle has to be to say that there should be universal rights to food, to healthcare, to education, to equal education. There has to be a common school system. There has to be effective labor rights and protections to workers. Uh, it should not be allowed to remain on paper as we have allowed it up now. There should be minimum decent housing standards for all. Clean water should be available to all people, etc. I think that there's some things that I hope desperately that we learn from this pandemic. Uh, and the middle class does not secure itself even more in its protection. Uh, Many countries with without adequate public health infrastructure, uh, but definitely better than ours. Countries like Spain, for instance, have taken a decision to nationalize private healthcare right during the pandemic. And that's something that I mean, I think it is so important and so obvious that we should do it. That all private health services till the pandemic is over at least should be privatized, and because it will be impossible for us to now start building a public health infrastructure which will actually be able to cope with the health needs of the poor. And also one thing that I wanted to very quickly underline is that COVID is not the only problem of the poor. Through all of this, every day of the lockdown, something between 1,500 and 2,000 people die every day of TB. And TB is a problem largely of the poor. More than 80,000 people are delivering babies every single day of the lockdown in very, very difficult circumstances. The number of people who are dying of malnutrition related numbers is even much higher. Now, none of that is going away. And in fact, because of the stress on the entire public health, whatever public health systems we have dealing with COVID-19, even these, what is going to accumulate is going to leave multiple burdens again on the poor. So I think that uh, Anukriti, it's not going to automatically happen. Uh, as a middle class, you and I constitute the middle class. I feel uh, we need to have a true sense of solidarity. Let us begin with thinking of that young girl in Bijapur as somebody who is somebody of your family and mine, and will we promise ourselves to ensure that we will not allow a child to have to go through what she had to go through. So I think that we'll have to build solidarity. I, I, I spent a lot of my life thinking about how we can change public policy to make it more just and more equitable. Uh, I reached a point when I realized uh, that a just and caring state of the kind that I seek can only exist in a just and caring society. And the problem is not something that you and I can outsource the blame to the state alone. We get the state that we choose. We get the policies that we support. There has to be sufficient solidarity. There has to be sufficient outrage that we cannot allow 60-70% of our people to live the way that they have been forced to live and to suffer the way that we are seeing them suffer before our eyes.
So, Harsh, following up on this question of what the middle class can do, Dahlberg has put out a hypothesis that the top 10% of this country, income wise, can support the bottom 50% of the poorest. And they say that, even that divided in percentiles, the top 1 percentile of this country is capable of supporting a large number of poorer families, and a direct cash transfer from the richest to the poorest will in some ways, or in a large way, alleviate the current problem that we are facing. Do you think that's a reasonable solution to what we're facing right now?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I just feel that a very modest wealth tax and inheritance tax, just these two, are more than sufficient to actually not only tide the poor over through the crisis that we are seeing today, but also build the foundation for those universal rights that we're speaking about. Let me give you another statistic actually, which is very striking to me. In the year 2017-18, and I think it's true for every year, uh, just the increase in the wealth of the top 1%, not the wealth of the 1%, the increase in the wealth in that year of the top 1% was more than India's union budget.
It
And
was more than India's
union budget, the
union budget.
full union budget was smaller than how much wealth of the top 1% increased in that year. The increase in the wealth of the bottom 50% was not more than 1%. So, we're talking about, and that money is here. It's here. We are not, when we say we don't have the resources, India has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. And it is that we're choosing not to tax the rich because of that comfort with inequality that I was talking about. I mean, I feel that we must demand inheritance tax is something that even from, even not just from a leftist perspective. I mean, even if you follow a bourgeois capitalist sort of ideology, you say we have the wealth because you earn it, but you certainly don't earn it because you've inherited it. So that argument just simply does not stand, and therefore inheritance tax is accepted in many parts of the world. About one third, 33% inheritance tax is something that we is long overdue in this country. And a small wealth tax itself would be enough to see us through this crisis. That wealth redistribution is absolutely imperative if we have to see through this crisis and also uh, build the kind of society which is more just and equal that we spoke about.
So, so clearly, the government's action is a very low hanging fruit, but we're unable to do it, and neither are we able to address the problems of industry. Today, Rajiv Bajaj put out a statement that this lockdown is a recipe for another pandemic. So clearly, even industry is not happy given the state of affairs. Do you imagine that there is a possibility of getting the rich and wealthy behind such an idea? And if so, what could propel such an initiative? What could we as civil society do to get the wealthy to look at it beyond philanthropy, beyond the 2% CSR?
I think that I think that there is a moral imperative that we must understand, and the rich must also uh, uh, recognize their duty to the social compact. Uh, but assuming that they do not, there is also a massive question of self-interest, and this is again something that economists have been, you know, uh, left economists have been trying to explain a great deal. That the only kind of growth is not a trickle down growth. There's also something that people call the bubble up growth. Now, just simply to understand, if you have small amounts of more cash in the hands of 800 million poorer people, they're going to use that cash. They're going to spend that cash. It's going to create high levels of effective demand. They will demand goods and services, and that is what I think is our strongest is the strongest push to bringing back the economy. So if we actually go with the universal basic income transfer for the next 2 or 3 years till we go through a recovery, uh, if we go really with this and we say that at least statutory minimum wages will be paid to every person through the next 2 or 3 years, uh, and we provide the resources for it, that money in people's hands is going to be spent in local markets. And more than anything else, it will create effective demand, and it will have a multiplier effect. And I think that it is entirely in the self-interest of the rich to actually build a more egalitarian society and economy. We for too long in the last 3 decades, especially since neoliberalism took root, we are continuously being told that we have to choose as a society between growth and equity. I think this is a completely spurious binary that has been created. For me, I think we have plateaued the kind of scale of growth, even before, much before the pandemic. Uh, how much growth can we build on such an unequal foundation? If India is going through what is called a demographic dividend, one of the things that people above 65, the age that I've just grown, are most at risk. In India, they just 6% of the population. 94% of the people are below 65. Every second Indian is below 25. Uh, we have strong, and when I watched the march of the migrants, what struck me was this is India's demographic dividend walking. They were all young people between 16, 17 and about the mid 30s, able-bodied, strong. That is why they could walk the distance that they did, wearing jeans, holding a smartphone. They were the people who actually, on their own, have are, to me, my mind, the true foundation of this economy, and we have done very badly with them. Suppose we could actually uh, ensure that they get decent wages, uh, ensure that they have some kind of social protection, ensure that the children get as good an education as your and my children get, ensure that they have universal health care. These are not pipe dreams. They're, you know, many countries in the world which have very high economic growth have done it on a foundation of universal education and universal uh, public funded healthcare. These are things that India must do, uh, and the rich must do it, not only from a sense of social responsibility. It is their only hope, and I'm completely convinced it is the only hope of mending our economy.
So the only hope for our society to mend itself is to lend itself towards a more equitable future.
Yes.
And despite that, one of our viewers is asking, Amit Lahiri is asking that in a country where thousands of people die from TB on a normal day, when there are so many malnourished children, and yet the government doesn't care for it, why is it that we are expecting the government or anyone else to care about it now?
Uh, no, people like us have been demanding that they care for a long time. You know, TB, just talking about TB and our work with the homeless, over the last few months, in fact, uh, COVID has really broken down. We developed a collaboration with somebody from University of London who's a specialist and was helping us. And we started doing very intensive uh, uh, checking for levels of TB among homeless men in Delhi. And he was astounded, this global expert, because we got something like 6.4% people with who were TB positive. And he said that even for poor working class populations, it's usually about 0.6%. So there's 10 times higher levels of TB among homeless men in our city. Uh, and if you're homeless and you're single and you get TB, even if you get into a public hospital, the maximum that somebody will tell you, the doctor will tell you, is now go home, let your family take care of you, eat nutritious food, have medicine every day. I don't have a home. I don't have a family. I don't have any kind of economic support while I'm sick. So I just die on the street. And I think that we have tolerated all of this. Uh, the response to the COVID, I mean, with some cynicism, we must admit that the total panic about COVID is also because we in the middle class feel threatened by it. If it was a problem that only hit the poor, we would have had a very different response to it. And I think that uh, I go back to that same question of solidarity to Amit, that it is only uh, if we who are not threatened by TB in the same way as the poor uh, have the same sense of outrage that poor people are dying in much larger numbers. I would like to underline much larger numbers through this entire period of the lockdown have died. Many times more people have died of TB in this period than have died of COVID. But we don't even notice. Let us start noticing.
So, and if we start noticing, possibly the next time such a pandemic comes, we possibly will have a more robust response to this. Which brings me to my final question from Vinod Menon, who asks that does the strangling of institutions like the NDMA, NHRC, NIA, RBI, would addressing that in some ways, um, alleviate the suffering that we're going through right now, apart from the solidarity that we're seeking?
No, no, absolutely, you're right, Vivek. I think that we are at a moment of great crisis in our democracy. What we are seeing is uh, various institutions, uh, those that you listed, but Parliament, uh, the judiciary, the National Human Rights Commission, uh, various other bodies which should have been, standing up and speaking out for the poor, are not doing their job. They're completely silent. The media, the independent media. A word about the independent media. Amartya Sen, in his lifelong work, has talked about why India never saw a famine after independence, and China did. And he said it was largely because of a free and very independent media, which points out when things are getting bad and an active opposition. And all of these work together to save us before we slip over the brink. But we are seeing a media which is largely, again, been destroyed as an institution. There's very little of the media which is independent. We are seeing large segments of the political opposition also silenced. So it is an enormous crisis. And the contrast, and local government. And the contrast, when we look at Kerala, which is the one bright spot across the country, I mean, its achievements have been stellar in this period. Uh, we look at why did Kerala succeed? I think most of all is the strength of its social democracy. It's local institutions. I mean, the Kutumbashri, the local panchayat board, all of them went into, have been strengthened, and a very strong civil society. All of them had come together and worked with the government in unison, with high levels of trust, high levels of communication, and two-way communication, uh, 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 which built it was a compassionate response, it was an egalitarian response, and it was technically the most effective. And I think that there are lessons about the importance of democratic institutions. When I said that how successful we will depend upon our solidarity, I could well have said uh, how successful we'll be will depend on the quality and depth of our democracy. Because true democracy, as our constitution reminds us, is built on the foundations, four foundations. The first of them is justice, the second is liberty, the third is equality, and the fourth is fraternity or solidarity. It is these foundations, how strong are these foundations of our republic, that will determine how successful we are to fight a crisis of the kind that we are confronted with.
Thank you so much, Harsh, for reminding us of our promise of fraternity to every citizen. And thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to Signable for providing sign language translation. Thank you, Prachi, for joining us. So we'll close this webinar today. Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you.